Hello everyone, wishing you a day filled with good health and joy. In today's video, we will listen together to the story of the day CEO Hung returned and the moment James realized that he no longer had to face his father alone. If you're ready, let's begin. The afternoon passed more slowly than usual. A light breeze blew, carrying the faint chill of day's end. The sounds around him seemed to drift farther away, as if the world had stepped back, leaving only James and the silence surrounding him. In that moment, James wasn't thinking about the present. He no longer felt time passing. His mind naturally drifted back to things long past, to words he had once spoken when he still believed that as long as he tried hard enough, everything would eventually be fine. He thought of that piece of land back then, a place not too far from town, spacious and peaceful. James had once stood there with Diep, telling her that this would be where they would begin again. Not a grand future, nor a life that others would admire, just a place quiet enough for Diep to breathe more easily, safe enough that she wouldn't have to look back at the heavy years behind her. James had spoken to Diep in a very slow, very steady voice. He said that if there was a place where opening the door brought a sense of peace, where returning home meant no need to be on guard, then that place was worth trading everything for. A small house would be enough. It didn't need to be big. It didn't need to be beautiful. It only needed them to still see each other every day, to still hear each other's breathing when night fell. At that time, James truly believed it. He believed that as long as he could hold on to that promise, everything else could be endured. The pressures from outside, the objections within the family, even the weariness in his own heart, all of it could be borne. But then, reality did not follow the path he had imagined. Those promises were not betrayed by outsiders. They were slowly suffocated by prolonged silences, by obstacles without explanation, by the cold gaze of a father James had once deeply respected. He didn't blame him, but he didn't understand either. And it was precisely that lack of understanding that made everything heavier. James took a deep breath. At that moment, a figure appeared at the end of the road. Without needing to look closely, James knew it was Hung. That way of walking, that rhythm of steps, neither hurried nor rushed, was exactly the same as before. Hung's appearance pulled James back to reality, like an invisible thread cutting through a stream of memories that had drifted too far. The two brothers stood side by side. There were no rapid-fire questions, just a very slight nod, as if both understood that each of them had walked through difficult stretches of their own. Hung looked at James, his eyes carrying no judgment, no curiosity, only the concern of someone seeing a family member again after a long time, and knowing that person had changed greatly. James realized in that very moment that he no longer felt as alone as he once had. Hung didn't press him with questions. He simply looked at James for a moment, then asked slowly, as if afraid of touching a wound that hadn't yet dried. "Why did you leave the company? Why did you choose to live like this?" James remained silent for quite a while, not because he didn't know how to answer, but because he was choosing where to begin. There are stories that, if told in the wrong place, sound like complaints, and James didn't want to complain. He let out a very soft breath. "Back then," he said, "being a leader wasn't like what people imagined. It wasn't just about making big decisions or holding power. It was the feeling of waking up every day carrying the responsibility for so many other people. One wrong decision, and it wasn't only he who paid the price. Pressure came from everywhere, from work, from relationships where he couldn't speak honestly, from meetings that dragged late into the night and still ended without clear answers. James was used to always appearing calm and steady, even when inside he was so exhausted that he could no longer feel himself. There were nights when he lay in bed for a long time without being able to sleep. His mind was always stretched tight like a string. The moment he closed his eyes, waves of thoughts rushed in. What if this happened tomorrow? What if that person betrayed him? What if he wasn't good enough? James said that, over time, he forgot what it felt like to live for himself. Everything revolved around the word must. Must be strong, must carry on, must endure, must keep going. Then, at some point, he realized he was no longer afraid of losing that position. What he feared was that if he continued, he would lose himself. When he decided to leave everything behind, James said, the first feeling wasn't pain, nor was it regret, as many people might think. It was relief. A strange kind of relief, as if someone had just lifted a burden from his shoulders that he had carried for far too long. No more midnight phone calls, no more scrutinizing eyes, no more having to prove who he was. His life now was much simpler. Less money, fewer choices, but in return, he could sleep. When he woke up in the morning, he knew what he would do that day, and in the evening, when he came home, he didn't carry the weight of an entire world on his back. James looked at Hung, his voice slow but firm. He wasn't running away. He was simply choosing to live. Not living to be better than anyone else, nor living to be acknowledged, just living without having to tense himself every single day. Living so that he would still have enough strength to hold on to the things that mattered most to him. Hung didn't speak right away. He just sat there, listening. And in that moment, Hung understood that James's decision wasn't an act of giving up, but a choice that had been weighed for a very long time, very deeply. After quite a long silence, James finally mentioned his father. His voice was different now, no longer steady like when he spoke about work, nor light like when he spoke about his current life. There was something heavier, pressing down on every word. James said that what troubled him most was not the fact that his father opposed Diep. If it were only opposition, he could understand it. His father had spent his whole life accustomed to control, accustomed to making decisions for others. What unsettled James was how sudden that change had been. Before that, his father had shown no harshness at all. At times, he had even silently accepted it. Not supportive, but not forbidding either. And then, in a very short span of time, everything completely reversed. His father became cold, rigid, and determined to stop James, as if that relationship were a danger that had to be ended at any cost. James said he had tried to ask, not once but many times. He wasn't demanding approval, nor asking anyone to change. He only needed an explanation, a reason clear enough for him to understand what he was facing. But what he received was always avoidance. His father would either remain silent or give perfunctory answers, or end the conversation with weary words, as if the very act of explaining were an unnecessary burden. Each time, James felt as though he were standing before a closed door. Not because he wasn't allowed to enter, but because there was something inside that didn't want to be revealed. That silence, James said, made him even more uneasy than outright opposition. Because when there is no explanation, people are forced to piece things together themselves. And the more he pieced them together, the more he realized how many gaps there were in the story of his father. James began to think about the past. Not the recent past, but more than 20 years ago. A time when his father was still very poor, struggling with life, and then suddenly left his hometown to go abroad for a long period. Back then, contact was almost completely cut off. No one knew what he did, whom he met, or what he went through. Then one day, his father returned. No longer the penniless man he once was, but someone with money, influence, and a position in society. People only saw the outcome, but no one truly knew the path he had taken to obtain all of that. James grew up in that abundance, accustomed to the image of a successful, strict, and reserved father. But the more he matured, the more he realized that the stories about that period were always left unfinished. No one told them. No one asked. And it seemed that no one was allowed to touch them. When his relationship with Diep met with such fierce opposition, James began to feel that all those scattered fragments were not accidental. He remembered the name John, a person who had appeared in fragmented stories, in heavy glances, in unspoken tension whenever the name was mentioned. A name that carried resentment whose origin James had never clearly understood. And then he realized that Diep had also inadvertently ended up standing in the middle of all those connections. James did not dare draw any conclusions. He told Hong that he only had a feeling, a very clear feeling, that what was happening now did not stem solely from the present. It was the consequence of decisions made long ago, of secrets buried deep enough to seem as though they would never return. He looked at Hong, his eyes no longer showing only fatigue, but a quiet worry. If that were true, James said, then his love with Diep had never been just a story of two people. It was touching a past he had never been allowed to step into. And that frightened him, not because of the truth itself, but because he did not know how much he would have to pay to face it. In that moment, no one said anything more, but both of them understood that from the instant James voiced these doubts, the road ahead could no longer return to what it once was. Because once a secret has begun to come into the light, it will not stop halfway. Hong didn't rush to respond. He sat there, listening to James's entire story from beginning to end, without interrupting and without showing either support or opposition. When James finished speaking, Hong remained silent for a moment, as if to make sure that every emotion had been set down before any advice was given. Then Hong spoke, his voice low and slow. He didn't deny James's suspicions, but he also didn't encourage him to confront the situation right away. He reminded James that, no matter what, that man was still his father. Words spoken while emotions were still tangled could easily become wounds that could never be taken back. Hong advised James to stay calm, not to force himself to have an answer immediately. The truth, if it existed, would not disappear simply because he waited a little longer. On the contrary, if he rushed, everything could be pushed too far, beyond the control of both sides. In Hong's view, what James needed right now was not a confrontation, but time. Time to look back, to piece together the past more clearly, and to wait until both sides were calm enough to truly talk. Hong didn't promise anything grand. He simply said that during that time, James would not be alone. When needed, he would be there. And it was precisely that calmness of Hong's that grounded James, preventing his doubts and rising emotions from carrying him too far. While James was still facing questions without answers, somewhere else, Diep's life continued at its own distinct rhythm. The fields opened wide and silent. Sunlight spread gently, not harsh, just warm enough to dry the remaining dew on the rows of plants. Diep bent down, her hands familiar with the soil, with the grass, with each motion of labor repeated day after day. There was no one watching, no words of encouragement, only the soft sound of the wind and the smell of earth clinging to every step. Diep worked slowly but without stopping. Every movement had become second nature, as if her body knew what to do without needing thought. For Diep, labor was not only a way to make a living, it was also how she kept herself steady amid changes she could not control. She didn't dwell on big matters. She didn't think about the past, nor did she try to foresee the future. At this moment, the only thing that mattered was completing the work before her. Harvesting each bundle of vegetables, arranging them neatly, preparing them to be taken to market. Each small task helped her feel that she was still in command of her own life. At times, when she was tired, Diep paused for a moment. Her back ached, her breathing grew heavier, but she didn't complain. She understood that if she stopped for too long, other thoughts would come, and Diep didn't want to let herself sink into questions she wasn't ready to face. Sweat soaked the back of her shirt, yet Diep's eyes remained calm. In the silence of the field, she neither showed weakness nor tried to prove anything. She was simply living, in the quietest and most steadfast way she knew. In that vast space, Diep's figure looked small, yet that very smallness carried a strength of its own, a strength that didn't come from words or hardness, but from continuing to move forward, even when no one could guarantee what lay ahead. Diep didn't know what James was thinking, whom he was talking to, or what secrets he was facing. But she knew one thing very clearly. No matter which direction things might turn, she still had to support herself, to keep herself from falling. And it was precisely that quiet resilience of Diep, out in the wide field, that became a silent anchor for everything unfolding behind the scenes. Hung didn't say much more. He didn't offer any grand-sounding promises, nor did he try to present himself as someone who would shoulder everything. After what James had shared, Hung understood that what James needed at this moment was not reassuring words, but the feeling of knowing he wasn't being left alone. Hung simply said that, for the time being, James could stay. Not out of pity, and not because James was in a weaker position, just because brothers should be beside each other when one of them is standing at a difficult crossroads. He said that if help was needed, he would help. If it became necessary to speak with their father, he would go along. Not to confront and not to apply pressure, but so that James wouldn't have to stand alone before things that felt too heavy. Hung didn't place himself in the role of the one who would solve everything. He chose only to stand behind James, close enough to pull him back if things began to go astray, and steady enough for James to lean on when needed. James listened, not replying right away, but he understood that Hung's presence at that moment was already a form of protection. Quiet, unshowy, but unmistakable. There are relationships that don't need many words to prove themselves. Simply not leaving when the other person is struggling the most is enough. Because family is not always the people who gave birth to you. It is those who choose to stay when you have nothing left but questions without answers. When James left, the afternoon was already waning. The familiar road leading him back to the small house was the same as always. Nothing had changed. The same old rows of trees, the same turns he had passed countless times before. Yet James's steps were slower than usual, not because of fatigue, but because what had just been said still lingered deeply in his heart. The conversation with Hung hadn't given him answers. It hadn't made his doubts disappear either, but it made James understand that some things cannot be rushed. Some doors, if opened before one is ready, only cause everything to collapse faster. James picked Knee up from school, and uncle and niece lit a fire in the yard to keep warm. Diep had also just returned after a long day in the fields. James sat with the child. He patiently pointed to each word, reading slowly, waiting for her to repeat after him. The immature sounds echoed in the small room, not perfectly formed, but very real. Each time she read correctly, James smiled and gently patted his hand in encouragement, as if in that moment, everything else could wait behind. In the kitchen, Diep prepared dinner. Familiar movements, unhurried, unburdened. From time to time, she asked James a short question, just ordinary daily matters. She didn't ask about Hong, nor did she ask about his father. Perhaps Diep understood that there were things James needed to sort out within himself before he could speak of them. The house gradually lit up under the soft yellow glow of the lamps. Not bright, not luxurious, but warm enough to dispel the weariness of a long day. In that small space, James realized the sense of peace he had traded so many things to hold on to. Outside, the questions about the past were still there. His father's secrets, the connections yet to be clarified, the things that might one day upend everything. James knew they hadn't disappeared. They were only temporarily stepping back, waiting for another moment to be faced. But at least in this moment, James didn't feel that he was walking the wrong path. He didn't know what he would have to face tomorrow. He didn't know how far the truth ahead might carry everything. But as he listened to the child reading each word, as he felt Diep's quiet presence behind him, James understood that even though the road ahead still held many unknowns, he was standing exactly where he needed to be. And that story was not yet finished. If you'd like to continue accompanying James and Diep on the road ahead, please follow the next video to listen to the stories that have yet to be told. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. Wishing you a truly peaceful evening, and see you again in the next episode.
Đêm ấy trong căn phòng nhỏ, vòng tay người mẹ đã xoa dịu những nỗi đau mà Diệp mang theo suốt một đời. Những giọt nước mắt rơi xuống không còn là nỗi tủi hờn, mà là sự giải thoát lần đầu tiên cô có được thấu hiểu, được yêu thương như một người con thực sự.